Board Member Elizabeth Callahan.
Here.
Board Member Nubia Duvall-Wilson.
Here.
Board Member Regina Eckert.
Here.
Board Member Bill Gifford. Board Member Will Meyer.
Here.
Board Member Shana Sackett-Gable.
Here.
Board President Kawi Telsford.
Here.
Board Member Arun Vadlamani. Board Member Caitlin Whitletter. And student representatives.
All right, please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Please take notice that the adequate notice of this meeting has been provided in the following manner. That written notice was sent from the office of the Secretary of the Board at 10:58 a.m. on July 15, 2024. That said notice was sent via email to Maplewood and South Orange Township clerks and the editors of the News Record, Star Ledger, the Village Green, and Tap into Soma. All right. The school board meeting is a business meeting in public and not a meeting with the public. Oftentimes, it may appear to members of our audience that the Board of Education takes action with very little audience or very little comment, and in many cases, a unanimous vote. Before a matter is placed on the agenda at a public meeting, the administration has thoroughly reviewed the matter with the superintendent. If the superintendent is satisfied with the matter, that the matter is ready to be presented to the Board of Education, it is then referred to the appropriate board committee. The members of the board committee work with the administration and the superintendent to assure that the members fully understand the matter. After the committee discusses the matter, it is then shared with the other board members for consideration. Only then is it placed on the agenda for board discussion and action at a public meeting. So today we have the Dr. Fergus' reflection on the implementation of the district plan and an update on year one progress of the district plan. Should we do hearing of individuals first and then? Yeah. So now we'll just do our hearings of individuals and delegations. Thank you for coming in person and dialing in by phone this evening. South Orange Maplewood Board of Education certainly respects that you've taken the time out of your busy day to address the Board of Education at tonight's meeting. We value public involvement in our school district, and we are eager to hear what you have to say. The board does have time limits by policy and will be enforcing those to enable as many people to speak as possible this evening. Each individual will be given 3 minutes to speak. Please do your best to stay within the time afforded to you. The first public comment period is usually limited to 1 hour, and the second public comment period may be limited to 30 minutes. All input shared with the Board of Education is taken very seriously and will inform future deliberations and work by the Board of Education and its committees. And let me just check online. Actually, I don't have my internet connected yet, so let me just check quickly. All right, we have no speaks. No one.
There's no sign up for in-person or virtual.
No, okay. So then we'll now move on to the presentations. So the first will be the reflection on the implementation of the district plan.
All right. Good evening. How's everyone doing? Happy summer. I know this is never an easy endeavor to have committee meetings and board public meetings going on during the summer, especially when there's so many plans going on. So excited that there is an opportunity to really share out just some quick updates in terms of what's transpiring. I won't take too long in terms of going through sort of where where we are in terms of in relation to the report that we provided, and as well as where the district is. And I'm going to do a little bit of an overview just to make sure that we kind of remind ourselves of sort of where we started in terms of why we needed to necessarily sort of have this endeavor going on. But also, most importantly, and you all have known this because you all have been versed in terms of the recommendations, what's behind sort of these recommendations, but more particularly, the time that it's going to take to really sort of work on these set of recommendations. I want to thank the district team that I got to work with this past school year. It was the first time that actually I was engaged by the district leadership team around the reports that I had generated over the last several years for South Orange Maplewood. They earnestly sort of not only invited me in, but I offered my time to meet with them monthly, and they took it, right? And we met every month on a Friday for a couple of hours in this room to really walk through how they were delineating their plans in relation to the recommendations. And I want to thank them for earnestly understanding that these recommendations are ones that are necessary for this school district to really not only sort of align with the set of agreements, but there was also an earnest understanding that there was also part of the moral compass that the South Orange Maplewood community was making an investment around. So I want to really applaud them for this set of work with the group I got to work with this past year. And I look forward to the work that's going to transpire over the next several years to really bring this to fruition. One of the things I want to make sure that I remind us, and in some ways as school board members, that you all hold steadfast in terms of your role as board members, is reconciling that there is an imperative around the policy, practice, and procedures that are duly important for ensuring that all of the kids in the community of South Orange Maplewood are able to access. And in particular, those that are tied back to the long vestiges of school desegregation and integration, right? We know that there is a long history of needing to desegregate schools, right? And the desegregation was really around removing the set of barriers, particularly the legal barriers and policies and so forth. And now we're moving into, and many communities have been moving towards reconciling that we have to move into a form of integration. So what does it mean for us to sustain this endeavor of really understanding that our charge is not just merely about ensuring that the barriers don't come back, but now that we are also adopting the recognition that it is about sort of learning what it means for us to be a racially, ethnically, linguistically, gender diverse community, an able-bodied diverse community, is not something that's easy, right? As Bell Hooks said many years ago, we never had a national curriculum to know how to get along, but a community like South Orange Maplewood, through integration work, can begin paving the way of showing what does it look like in a community like this that has a moral discussion all the time about what it means to integrate. So that charge really is one that as Robert Carter is one of the lawyers for the LDF at the time of the Brown versus Board, made the case that it's not only just about desegregating, but we've got to integrate ourselves, right? And that takes a lot of work, particularly for communities that are now having to take this on. And I'm so glad that you all at South Orange Maplewood are sitting here wanting to do this, right? And establishing a committee that is very much charged with doing this work. So the support that we've been providing has taken the form of 3 different sets of reports that, as you all may be particularly aware of. You may be most familiar with the most recent report, which is the one that we shared out we finished it in June 2023. We presented, I believe it was September of 23, in which I was in this room for about 2.5 hours presenting that report. But I also want to highlight that that report is also in alignment with the other 2 reports that also told looked at other areas of educational practice within South Orange Maplewood that, bless you, that's outlined those same sets of patterns, right? So I want to make sure that as we talk about this one particular report, that we also sort of maintain the spirits of the other 2 that also help to support what we were able to arrive at with the June report. In particular, the June report that we submitted, the report number 3, we obviously sort of paid particular attention to overall disparity patterns in special ed, gifted AP and honors, and discipline. We also pay particular attention to math curriculum, and as one area of curricula to understand what happens to kids in terms of the learning that they get exposed to, and as well as the outcome that transpires, the nature of the culture and climate that is available for racially and ethnically diverse, racially and ethnically underrepresented populations, which here in South Orange Maplewood is your Black and brown populations, right? And then lastly, looking at your intervention supports, right? Your tiered supports, and particularly what's here in New Jersey is called INRS, Intervention and Referral Services, right? So we looked at those areas. We did a lot of document reviews. We did a lot of interviews. In particular, I think what has been, and you all probably read this in the reports and may have seen it in the presentation from September, that the students, particularly your Black students here in South Orange Maplewood, spoke very poignantly about their set of experiences that I think really told a textured understanding of, it's one thing to teach math, it's another thing to hear kids talk about what it means to be in those classes, to feel undervalued, to feel as if they have less of a cognitive ability and don't deserve to be in those courses. So I always want to annotate the amazing sort of bravery that particularly the Black students shared in the focus groups that we did with them, and as well as what school staff who were brave to share some of their own sort of experiences that they've been noticing, both staff of color and white faculty in in the school district. So with that said, you all are familiar with the disparity patterns that are existing in your community, and I'm not going to spend too much time with this because I really want to go to the recommendations and talk through sort of what I want to lift up around it, and in particular the areas to which in the dialogue work that I've been doing with the district team, what is landing as sort of some of the areas of imperative that we need to pay particular attention to. As you all are familiar, or you may be familiar, part of the analysis that we did was we looked at we used one particular disparity formula. Again, this is a disparity formula that is used by the Department of Justice. It's also used by the Office of Civil Rights. It's also used by the Legal Defense Fund, right? So this is not, as I've heard many districts say, oh, we're using the Fergus disparity formula. It is not my formula. I did not, okay? This actually comes out of epidemiology. They use relative risk ratios to really determine patterns of risk around health concerns, right? In that formula, that calculation allows us to know the amount of risk. And this is the metric. Anything at 1.0 is equal risk. Anything above 1.0 is an elevated risk. Anything below 1.0 is a lowered risk. So what we annotated was, and as you all know, and you'll see here in these graphics, I'll show you a trend from between 2018 to 2018 to 2022. The patterns of special education relative risk ratio, you'll see each group as they come up, that anything above the the axis that's there, you'll see the red arrow off to the left, that anything above that 1.0 is an elevated risk, anything below that is a lowered risk. And you'll see as I put all of the racial ethnic groups here, you will see that there is a particular pattern in which you'll see especially your Black and Latinx kids having the most elevated pattern. As I noted in the report, your Native American student population is very small. It is actually below the cell count that we can actually sort of stipulate that this is a significant pattern, right? So that's the one caveat I want to make sure that people understand when they see this graphic, that your Native American student population is below 20. So it really is too small for us to really incur any sort of designation that this is a risk that is transpiring. But we know that there's enough of a count in your Black and Latinx student population relative to all others where they have the highest risk of ending up in special education. I'll also add in as an addendum that one of the projects that I currently have is I have a contract with the State Education Department of New Jersey to work with every district that is cited for special ed overrepresentation. And In that project, it's based on a requirement from the federal government that every state cite school districts for overrepresentation of kids by race in special ed. The threshold for being cited is 3.0, right? Meaning that group has to be 3 times more likely. Now, South Orange Maplewood has not reached that threshold. I know that because I see the lists, and you all are not on that list. However, you're still disproportionate. And it's one of the things I always remind school districts that may not reach the threshold for the state to send you a letter, but anything above 1.0 is a elevated risk and should be of concern. And so I appreciate the fact that you all may not be cited, but you are taking this seriously in terms of reconciling. This is a pattern of disparity. The other area that we saw patterns of disparity were in terms of your gifted AP and honors. Particularly, we honed in on honors and AP. There were some glitches in terms of the data on the sort of elementary side, so we honed in really on the honors and AP. And I have to make sure that I annotate for you all that one of the patterns, and I mentioned this back in the fall, that is clearly occurring is that your Black and Latinx student populations is actually having an elevated pattern of risk, meaning a positive risk in terms of ending up in honors courses, right? And as you all saw in the report, as some of the school staff shared out, that some of that has to do with the moves that were being made by counselors and as well as teachers and school administrators to encourage students to move into honors classes, right? And I think that is a promising set of moves, right? That we see reflected in this pattern of data over time. However, as I said in the fall and as I said in the report, that honors appears to be a bit of a ceiling for where Black and Latinx kids are ending up. When we looked specifically at AP courses, the distribution demonstrated that Black and Latinx students are underrepresented, right? In fact, what we found is your white students had the highest risk or the highest probability or likelihood of ending up in AP courses. Now, this aligns with some of the testimony that the students shared, the Black students in particular, finding themselves in AP courses and quote unquote, as we highlighted in the report, quote unquote, this Black student stating, "I did not feel welcomed. I did not feel supported." And so many of them were actually exiting the AP courses, right? And we got testimony as well from school staff who also substantiated that students were leaving because of not feeling welcomed in those particular environments, right? And so as I talk later about those recommendations, right, particular to that it's not just a matter of getting them in, but it's also how do we change the culture and climate of what's happening in those classes, right? Then the last piece of data I'm going to point to is around the discipline. Now, discipline, you'll notice that it's only one particular juncture of data because of the nature of the discipline data that was available, right, to be able to do a more longitudinal analysis. So we just teased out looking at it relative risk by race, by free and reduced lunch status, and by gender. And what we noted was that during the 21-22 school year, Black students had they were 5 times more likely than anyone else in terms of being disciplined. And then the other pattern was around free and reduced lunch students as well. And there's probably points of overlap between those two populations in terms of their relative risk, relative to especially non-free and reduced lunch eligible students. So overall, we know that the patterns of disparity are very clear and prominent in South Orange Maplewood. And I always say, you're no different than any other district. I think the only difference is that you all are taking this on to change it, right? To make sure, how do we interrupt our systems so these patterns aren't predictable, right? And that takes a lot of sort of heavy lift to do those sort of changes. And that's where the recommendations really come in, right? A key piece of this is not only sort of doing these practices, and I think this is, but it's a matter of building the policy to institutionalize this. I think an element of your policy of institutionalizing is the fact that you have the committee. You've established a committee that is going to work steadfast on this particular issue, right? You're not going to lose sight of this in terms of sort of the importance of it. And so I appreciate and applaud you all for taking that step forward, right? So that involves sort of looking very closely at each one of these set of recommendations that are very robust. In working with the district leadership team this past year, the curricular area is a significant lift that has to transpire. Much of what, and I know you all have seen elements of what they have built into, I believe it's a 5-year plan, if I remember correctly, or 3 to 5 year plan that stipulates, particularly around the curriculum side, a complete redevelopment of how curriculum is adopted, the ways in which professional development has to align to ensure that the set of individuals who are taking the lead around this work, those who are in the classroom, and as well as those who support those in the classroom, that there is an intentional recognition that this development of this new curriculum is about ensuring that all of your kids are getting the cognitive exposures that has not been readily available to everyone. As you all remember in the report, especially in the math curriculum analysis that we did, that we showcased, and it was in the curriculum, that students who were in the 6th grade math sequence had to take 10 days of learning how to be a good student, while the students who were in 6th grade pre-algebra did not have to spend 10 days to learn how to be a good student. And there's layers of presumption, as you all know, about making that type of distinction. And trust me, I asked the question, how did we know, what are the presumptions that we were working with, that that's the thing as to why there's a difference between grade 6 math students and grade 6 pre-algebra students, right? And I could never get a real answer to that, right? And so it's those types of curricular shifts that needed to transpire, right? To build, to change those elements, and as well as another critical piece was changing the exposure of cognitive skills work. As you all saw in the report, the learning objectives that were outlined in grade 6 math were at the lower rungs of what's called Bloom's taxonomy in terms of higher order thinking skills. So the thinking skills that were being prominently placed in grade 6 were all around recall, right? Versus in pre-algebra, kids were getting exposed to higher levels of cognitive skill work, which is around analysis and evaluation. And as you can imagine, when you're constantly asked recall questions from year in to year out, your brain gets adjusted to that type of questioning technique and answers. But if you're accustomed to synthesis and evaluation level questions, you're getting pushed in a different level of cognitive work, right? And so the work that the district team has been working on this past year that I got to sit in and they were sharing back with me is, what does it mean for us to now reconfigure the math curriculum in such a way as involving all layers of cognitive work happening in these set of courses. And that has involved making determinations as to, one, do we sustain the tracks that exist, the grade 6 math track and the grade 6 pre-algebra track? And two, what does it look like to reconfigure the curricula in such a way that kids are getting the higher order sort of cognitive skill development over time and are not relegated to the type of cognitive skills that they're presumed to only carry because they started off in a very specific track. The other big curricular sort of adjustment was around the need to also enrich and accelerate kids. And I know the district team has been defined as part of their development is, so we have kids who are already in the pipeline who we did not expose them to higher order thinking work, particularly around curriculum. So what do we do to make those adjustments? The next piece I'm going to talk briefly around is in terms of the intervention supports. So, and this touches on the last point that I made around enrichment opportunities to grow kids' cognitive exposure. Part of what's transpired, and this goes back to the first report that I did for South Orange Maplewood, where I honed in on INRS to say, look, you have kids who need supports, and the only route for support that was available that had a level of consistency was special education. And unfortunately, that was predicated, that process was predicated on the assumption that any difference was a disability, when in fact, it could just merely be a difference, right? It was clear from the first report that we did to the third report that we did that that there wasn't a level of fidelity to having tiered intervention supports available for all of the kids who are needing it, right? So the big lift that the district team that I got to work with them this past year in terms of outlining is, so what does it look like to not only sort of have the types of interventions available for kids to repair, right, the types of learning difficulties that they're having, but also how do we deepen the capacity of staff so that we're not growing the number of kids who need intervention supports, but rather we are able to address them within the core instruction and the core curriculum. And this is where we touch back on the curricular piece, that if we don't sort of needing to seed it into that set of work, or needing to align it between both the intervention supports and the curricular work. So I know that one of the pieces that the district team had been working on is the implementation process guide that had been in existence, right, for several years in the district, but yet each school had found their own ways of making sense of it and applying it. And that doesn't necessarily work at the onset, because part of building that guide was, what was necessary was to first norm that we agree that this is what is needed. So, you know, it's what we noticed in the document reviews that we got to do was that there was a process guide that was given out to all the schools, but everybody created their own flavor of what it could look like in terms of implementation, rather than starting with, let's first implement it to the fidelity of what we outline, and then we can do adjustments over time, right? So the big lift that's needing to continue transpiring is really the tightening of the process actually being followed. And then the last piece that I'll mention around the recommendations, the big piece, was really around, there was very specific areas of developing not only an equity lens that exists as part of the adult capacity, but also that lives as part of the policy, practice, and procedural agenda of the district, right? You know, as a community, you all have been committed to having this moral compass around being an inclusive community, right? I know that there is a lot of community sets of events that happen that are about integration and inclusion, and I know the district has been committed to it. But it is also recognizing that in doing that, we also have to confront the manners in which at times we can have biased sets of perspectives that have to be interrupted, right? And so part of what we annotated in the report were some of those patterns that were existing among the adults and as well as the practices that were transpiring. So part of what we outlined here was the need for the nature of sort of professional development that lends itself for developing an equity lens that is connected to the pedagogical mission of the district. For example, in the adoption of curricula, there needs to be a pedagogical frame, and there are existing pedagogical frames that that contain a culturally responsive lens as to the manner in which the curriculum is outlined and the way it is taught. Now, those frameworks are ones that are not part of the landscape of how teachers have gone through teacher prep programs. As somebody who is at a university, I've been at universities for 20 years, I've been 3 different universities, and the ways in which we have trained teachers to be in the classroom has not involved ensuring that they develop a culture responsive lens. I will be the first one to tell you that in every university I've been at NYU, Temple, and now at Rutgers, that the development of a culture responsive lens is always left to the diversity class. And that doesn't align with the type of research that's already existing, regarding particularly around curricular frameworks that have been developed to really ensure that a culture responsive lens is practiced among the educators. In working with the district team, I shared with them some of those pedagogical frames, right? And they are taking them on as part of both the professional development sequence that I'm sure they have shared with you all for the next 5 years, and as well as part of the curricular work that needs to transpire over the next 5 years, right? But all of that connects back to sort of the need to ensure that if we're going to integrate, the adults also have to learn integration, right? Because they're also coming in with their own sort of lived experiences that may not necessarily carry exposure to what it looks like to do integration. The last couple of things that I'll mention in terms of the recommendations were, there was a particular attention to and recognition that there is an absence of diversity in terms of the educator force here in South Orange Maplewood. Previous, school boards here or school board members have talked about the importance of it. I just wanted to lift it up because the kids brought it up. They brought it up often. And in particular, they brought it up under the auspices of, we just don't know who to talk to, so we go to these teachers who help us make sense of how do we deal with it, right? So in some ways, these teachers were actually operating as safe havens for them to be able to manage for what some of the students were sharing out were patterns of microaggression, right? And then the last piece is around the building out the types of affinity spaces particularly for students of color who found those safe spaces as refuge for themselves, right? I had the privilege of meeting with a lot of the MAC scholars, and it was amazing to hear how they have valued so much that space where they can literally let their hair down in a way that they didn't find themselves having to translate who they are in a different way so others can feel comfortable with them. So the last thing I want to mention that I'm going to pause is there's a couple of key things I want to recommend as the implementation is moving forward. Because I've had an opportunity to work with the district team this past year, I can sit with a level of certainty in terms of some of these next key pieces as important. One is I want to make sure that as you all are looking at these recommendations, particularly as a committee, is that you're intentionally braiding them into a district strategic plan, right? So that I understand that you want to make sure, and you should make sure that you're staying in line with the agreements that are existing with the school district. So, and that can still exist. And braiding it in as part of a core mission of your strategic plan work, right? And I say that only because having worked with many districts over time is school boards shift over time. And the concern is making sure that these set of changes are not ones that are for the moment, but become institutionalized and part of the fabric of the district, right? I always remember one of my stats professors saying to me early on, that sometimes, we find ourselves reverting back to the mean. And the worry is that if we don't institutionalize some of these elements, there may be other touch points where it may revert back to the mean. And we have to reconcile that we can't revert back to the mean. So one of my sort of recommendations around the implementation process of the recommendations is to look for ways in which to build it in as part of your district strategic plan. You can still annotate it as like these come out of these reports, right? Because you want to make sure that you're adhering to the agreements, but making sure that they are also braided in as part of those strategic plans so they're not sitting as these outliers and separate and apart from other district-led initiatives. The second big piece I want to sort of support is and I also wanted to sort of make a notation around, in terms of this first piece around braiding the report 3 recommendations, is to also consider changing the name of your committee from the Fergus Committee. Right. I would recommend that, because it's harking it to a report or a person, but rather it needing to be just, it is the district policy committee on equity, whatever you may want to call it, but making sure that it's something you're adopting, right? Because y'all ain't adopting me. No, you're adopting these set of recommendations that are part of your moral compass, right? So that's a recommendation I wanted to make sure I put out there. The second piece I want to sort of, for you all to consider as part of the implementation of these recommendations is the progress monitoring around the implementation, right? I know that there are elements of progress monitoring that are part of the agreements, right? And those elements are going to continue. But those shouldn't be the only places in which we are progress monitoring the implementation of what's happening. It should also become part of the fabric of how that actually is happening as far as in terms of the district-led work and as well as school board members, right? And some of that means examining system implementation, right? So meaning looking at the outputs, right? One of the things I always, as I work with school districts when I help them build out plans is how often do you expect to do that thing? Let's go back and measure, did you do the thing as often as you said you were going to do it, right? Examining the impact of your implementation, right? Again, in the agreements, you're going to see my face as part of, ensuring that, you're moving in the right direction around your outcomes, right? In terms of the impact of these changes, but that shouldn't be the only time it happens. It should also be part of the fabric of what this committee does, and as well as what the district-led team does. And then lastly, doing the exact same thing in terms of examining the culture and climate impact, right? One of the things I'm always mindful of, and I've learned this in all of the research work I've gotten to understand and get to do over the years, is recognizing that the nature of these system changes should trickle down to the level of texture change for the kids. The kids should be able to notice that there is a market change that has transpired. And I would encourage you all to consider that part of your progress monitoring includes also talking to kids, and particularly the students who have disproportionately been affected by the patterns of the system. Your Black students, your male students, and your students with disabilities, and as well as communicating and interacting with parent communities around the nature of the culture and climate impact that's transpired. So with that, I am going to pause here for questions, thoughts, maybe some answers that you all may have for me.
Board Member Meyer?
Right. Dr. Fergus, first, thank you so much for showing up on a late January evening to chat with us here. It's really helpful to have you here. I guess what I'm curious about is, we're rounding the corner on 1 year since you gave your presentation to the board, and just about 1 year from when our monitoring with Justice Wallace started. Now, that monitoring is its own thing as far as getting us through the 3-year time frame for compliance, but your recommendations, of course, go beyond simply complying with the settlement and go to the actual substance of making progress in the school system. With your frequent visits
Leadership was doing their best to try to sort of stay focused on this to the point where, we got a chance to, they gave me an opportunity to look at their 3 to 5 year plan and to give them a lot of feedback, and feedback that from one meeting to the other, they actually shifted as a result of what the feedback I gave. And they know me. I was not I did not sugarcoat my feedback in terms of what they were outlining. In some areas, I would ask hard questions. How feasible do you Definitely. So for example, I think about the output of, there's a substantive level of professional development that is planned out, right? I love professional development. I'm a big fan of recognizing that when teachers come into the field, they're still starved for more knowledge building. And too often we don't give them enough, right? And they're hungry for wanting to have that. And so the output that I'd be curious to see is to ensure that that we're meeting the outputs or the dosage targets that we have around what it takes to, for example, around curriculum, to know a curriculum, to practice a curriculum, to adapt a curriculum. That takes a level of adult learning habits that can only come through sort of patterns of professional development that include, professional development that is about knowledge building, skill building, behavioral work, and coaching, right? And so I'd love to see the nature of outputs that speak to those, right? Being able to see when you look at the iterations of outputs, how much knowledge building PD did we give staff? How much skill building PD did we give staff? How much coaching PD did we give staff to ascertain our staff at a good place in terms of their implementation? So that's sort of as an example, and I hope that answers your question around how to look at sort of the outputs.
I had a question.
Is that Board Member Bowles? Sure, please.
Okay, and we got cut off, so apologies if this was already asked similarly by Board Member Meyer. So wanted to talk a little bit about math. In our 5-year plan, which it sounds like you looked at, it talks about making the lower tiered math courses more rigorous. And as you mentioned in your presentation about reconfiguring our math curriculum, I just wanted to know if you felt like what we currently have in our plan when it comes to making the lower tiered math more rigorous is living out the vision that you had for how we can support the needs of those students.
Yes, so part of what needs to, and I'm remembering sort of the meetings that we had specifically around this math piece, is that there's a twofold element. There is that which that you build out as part of the middle school math curriculum, the 6th, 7th, and 8th, that scaffolds itself or additive, right? So that kids are getting an aligned experience where they're getting to continuously grow their cognitive skills, but it's has to be predicated on that which what we're offering at the elementary school. So the question, and this is part of the, I remember the meetings that we had about this is, and we didn't get a chance to do it as part of our report in terms of as a set of documents that we looked at very closely, which is what's the nature of what's happening at the elementary school in terms of math skill development that sets kids up for their readiness for this redevelopment of math curriculum in middle school, right? Like, so both things have to happen at the same time for the populations of kids that are going to be sort of walking through your middle school program, math programming. And so that would be my, so how I in sort of what I'm hearing, what I saw in terms of that 3-year plan pays attention to those two elements that have to transpire.
Board Member Eckert?
Dr. Fergus, thanks again for again joining in the middle of the summer. As you noted, it's certainly challenging to get folks in a meeting room, as you can see right now. I just a quick follow up to that, as you talked about middle school readiness. We just implemented a new K-5 math curriculum, and so what is that time frame in which you have to evaluate and analyze how that is actually preparing those students for middle school math? Because I'm thinking about, you know, the plan that we have in place. Does that, in your meetings with the district, did you see that kind of appropriated in their plan?
Right. That's a great question. You know, so I think in terms of, you're right, there is your math curriculum at the elementary level, you know, and if I remember correctly, I think it's in the 2nd year of adoption, if I remember. I'm trying to remember my notes on it, you know, and that's still early in terms of the degree to which staff are have readily absorbed the cadence or the pacing that the curriculum is laying out for the development of kids, right? One of the things I'm always very mindful of at the elementary level is, you know, we certify teachers at the elementary level to be able to teach multiple subject areas, right? And so you're going to have some staff at the elementary level who have a better proclivity to social studies than language arts, or more to math, or, you know, and so the adoption of a new curriculum like math, right, means that we have to make sure that there is the right level of PD that's being made available so that staff are implementing, one, the curriculum, but two, that the kids are garnering the types of skills that we're expecting them to gain as a result of that curriculum. Now, the other piece around, and I can't speak to this because I don't remember if I specifically, if we talked about this in the district meetings that I was a part of, is the degree to which, what are in the new elementary math curriculum, what are the types of cognitive skills practice that kids are getting exposed to that can align to that which we're looking at for the middle school, right? As to make sure that there's a good bridge between what's existing in elementary as you bridge into the middle school. The second thing that I will also note is also aligning it to the tiered intervention supports process that you're also needing to tighten, right? So, for example, math may be an area where if there are gaps that live between what exists in the new math curriculum at the elementary level and what you are looking at in terms of moving into at the middle school, the intervention tiered supports process may be a conduit to do some of the scaffolding for your kids, right? Because whatever differences and gaps that kids may incur, it may not be the result of their doing, but rather gaps in how the adults have absorbed well enough to be able to teach it well, so that they understand that the kids are moving in the direction of adopting the types of cognitive math skills we're wanting them to do. So I think there, you know, there will need to be sort of a close attention of mapping the math skills, the cognitive skills, and also aligning it with intervention supports between the elementary and the middle school.
Any other questions? Member Callahan?
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you again. There was a lot of really interesting content and overviews, and I really appreciated you talking a little bit about the months that you did get to spend with our district team and the work that is done there. Because to your point, I think reading a report versus really like engaging together, getting that active feedback, those are different things. And so it's been exciting to me to know that that's happening, and for our community to know that that's happening as well. So thank you. I wanted to pivot back a little bit to special education for a moment, the disparities that you noted there and the work that you do in disproportionality in that realm. So we've looked at those patterns in our special education committee where we've looked at them. One of my goals for next year is to really put some deeper progress monitoring on that, so we have eyes on that on a more frequent basis. But I would love to hear a little bit from you, knowing that we are kind of below that threshold and would love to stay there, thinking proactively about steps that would integrate, to your point, around not making INRS kind of a segue to a CST referral, but rather using it actively. What are some of the proactive moves that you typically coach districts on that could be helpful for us to kind of have an eye on here?
It's a great question. So what's and in some ways I'll give you all insight to the work that I'm getting to do with 43 other districts here in New Jersey around this issue of disproportionality in special ed. Is that one is in terms of the tiered supports process, one recognizing that INRS is geared towards supporting teachers to support students. The legislation says it's about supporting teachers to support kids. Unfortunately, what's happened in terms of the translation that has occurred since 2007 is that many districts have translated INRS to be, let's fix the kid. So let's send the kid to somebody, and if the kid doesn't get fixed, then it's the child study team's turn to do it. So on one hand, there's an element of, there's a misunderstanding of INRS. And as you can imagine, just changing or reconciling that there is a process that needs to exist that is about building the supportive staff to be able to support kids, also going to require a culture change. One of the things that I keep noting with a lot of the districts I work with is that staff are pushing back because it was like, well, that's not how we've always done it. I was like, well, and it's, it takes a brave leadership to say, we were wrong in how we roll this out. It's actually about supporting you to support kids, right? So one, there has to be a reconfiguration and understanding of what INRS is. Two, there has to be a concerted effort around building out tier 2 and tier 3 types of supports that are geared towards addressing the skill areas that kids are needing a different layer of support that go beyond the classroom context, right? What I find is a lot of districts end up with tier 2 and tier 3 types of interventions that are global in nature, but are not targeted to the skills that kids are struggling with, right? So for example, they'll have a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention that is about reading globally, but not targeted to, is it a phonemic awareness issue? Is it a phonics issue? Is it a fluency issue, right? And which touches on sort of another area, which is that the manner in which they have resourced intervention supports, right, has not met the needs of kids, which means that for quite a few districts, they're having to reallocate dollars to actually appropriately resource that intervention supports, right? The other piece that is that I also work with districts around is in terms of the evaluation process itself. So there are particular, the field of special education has shifted over the years, in particular the attention around what are the types of discrepancy models that we use to determine, does a child have a disability, and or is it a disability that we developed as educators in the child, right? Is it an absence of us giving something? Thus, the way in which we look at the discrepancy between a child's achievement and a battery of tests, that our interpretation is the kid's missing stuff, but we don't contextualize whether or not they're missing it is because we haven't given it to them, right? So it may be a curriculum-based disability, right? And so, so an element of the work that I support districts around is to re-examine closely what is the discrepancy approach that they're using within the context of evaluation. And so what I've seen a lot of districts do, particularly the directors of special ed, is that they have weighed in heavily on reviewing every case with a close scrutiny, and at times have brought in other experts, psychologists, right, to review these files, right, to almost do a panel review to ensure, is this a true disability, or is this a disability as a result of an absence of quality instruction and intervention supports over time, right? So those are some of the pieces that I work directly with school districts in terms of identifying, and I see consistently occurring, right, as to why there ends up being sort of these patterns of overrepresentation in special ed. And in particular, there is an element to which it's happening most concertedly with Black and brown populations, because there is also a nature of an undercurrent of understandings that also play a role in terms of the ways in which supports are provided and or rationalized in terms of lack of skills, that there are interpretations that are being made about Black and brown populations that presume a lowered cognitive ability, right? And you'd be surprised what people tell me, where they will say, well, and I've been in meetings where they say, well, the Black students, they live in communities where they have a lot of power lines. And so I think that that's causing their disability. And I'm like, well, none of us are Aaron Brockovich, so I don't think we can make that case, right? Like, and and that's because folks are bringing in their own understandings of where some of these cognitive gaps may exist for groups, particularly for racial, ethnic, minority populations, right? That it has to do with the group versus it having to do with the absence of actual sort of consistent tiered supports and quality instruction. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Of course.
Board Member Sackett-Gable.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Fergus. So in the past, you've spoken about how changes in a school district can surface feelings that things are being taken away from certain groups of kids. And then today, you've also spoke to the need for the community to understand and be on board as much as possible with changes to how our school system operates. Have there been any recommendations from your discussions with the district about how to achieve this coherence?
So yes, we've had some conversations around, so one of the things when thinking about implementation is I'm always asking the question of what's the message that we're giving and who's giving the message, right? And not only for the school community, but also for the broader community, right? Especially in a community like South Orange Maplewood, right? That I've had the experience of, attending some meetings where I hear the levels of sort of discomfort around how some parts of the community are interpreting some of this integration work, right? And so the conversations I've been having with the district is, okay, so what's the message that needs to come from the district? And when I say the district, not only sort of the staff here, right, but also board members. What's the message that we're sharing out, and who's giving the message? We exist in a racially, ethnically diverse population and society that is striving to learn about itself and how to interact with others. And at times, some of that also involves being able to know who can give the best messaging, right? Particularly when each one of us exists with a level of affinity bias, right? Meaning we all gravitate towards people that are like us, whatever that like us is. I'm a big time runner. I've been a runner for 38 years now. So I'm all about, you're a runner, we're talking. we're hanging out. I know what you're all about, right? Because there's just a level to which I can connect. But it also can blind me at times because I can overly favor another runner because, oh, I understand them because they're like me, right? And so as we are rolling out these messages, I think we're going to do some work here. The work that needs to happen is also giving an opportunity for folks to develop perspective taking skills so they can break out of their affinity bias points, right? So that may involve having, whether it's community meetings about this, that is multiracial, that is multi-ethnic, right? To ensure that we're giving our community also an opportunity to practice some of that perspective taking that is not only for the community, but dare I say, it's also modeling for the kids, right? Because what I also got to hear from the kids, particularly the Black students, was, recognizing that there wasn't always, they were not only sort of experiencing patterns of bias that may be coming from the adults, but they were also experiencing it with their peers. And for me, that is also kids are demonstrating what they know based on what they see. And in a community like South Orange Maplewood that has various facets of inclusion, how do you become much more intentional about practicing perspective taking that involves breaking out of our affinity bias touch points, right? And that's going to be some of the work that I would encourage you all. Not only I know the district members, we've talked about it, but I also want to encourage you all as school board members. What's the messaging? Who's giving the messaging? And what's your work in terms of also maintaining this moral compass around intentional integration?
I have another question. So we've been talking about implementation, also looking at outputs and outcomes. And I think one of the major points is monitoring. And I know last fall you mentioned that it's very important for the district to get, I guess, adequate data systems up and running to really monitor students' progress, looking at their PD. For teachers, what discussions have you had with the district about this, and have they provided you with any sort of insight into what they're planning on doing with their data systems?
I'll be honest, I don't recall that we got to talk about data infrastructure, what type of data systems are existing to help feed themselves, right? What's going to be implemented, So I can't adequately answer that question. That may be something to add of the district team.
Oh. Former Duvall Wilson.
Hey, I just had, it's more of a comment and it's midnight where I am, so I'm hoping that I'm making sense. So I'm glad that Board Member Eckert mentioned our new math curriculum in elementary school. And Dr. Fergus, to your point about evaluating elementary school math and how it leads to supporting middle schoolers, I was looking at our most recent 5-year plan, and I don't see that aspect in the action section when it comes to looking at our math curriculum. And so I would recommend, if I'm looking at the most up-to-date version, that we integrate that into the action plan when it comes to looking at how our elementary school math is doing from that perspective. To your point, I know that they're going to be looking at how the math is going, how the new curriculum is going in the elementary school, but currently in the action plan, it doesn't talk about how that reflects with supporting our middle schoolers and the various levels and pathways that they'll be taking.
All right, thank you. All right, we'll have our second hearing of individuals and second hearing of individuals and delegations. Great. Thank you.
Thank you,
Yes, thank
Dr.
you.
Fergus.
You're all done. Yeah.
I know, I know. I do want to echo some of Dr. Fergus's sentiments, especially about the equity work. About 50% of this equity work is adult relationships. It's, and from a board perspective, it's governance-based monitoring. It's also adopting policies, practices, and expectations. That at the base is equity. And as a board, those are the governance tools that are available to us. And if we utilize those tools effectively, I think South Orange Maplewood School District will be in the national spotlight for the work they've done around equity.
All right, so there are no individuals, no one has signed up. Thank you. All right, so I guess we can move on to new business. Anyone have any new business? Okay. Okay, the Board of Education will meet in public session on Thursday, July 25th, 2024 at 6:30 p.m. in the District Meeting Room at 525 Academy Street in Maplewood, New Jersey. Immediately following the opening of public session, the board will move to go into a closed session in the superintendent's office at 525 Academy Street in Maplewood, New Jersey, as well as using an online video conference platform to discuss personnel matters with the attorney-client privilege, legal negotiations, and other matters that may arise and require discussion to be announced at a later date. Immediately following the closed session, the Board of Education will meet in public session, estimated to be at 7:30 p.m. in the District Meeting Room at 525 Academy Street in Maplewood, New Jersey, in person, utilizing an online video conference platform, which will include hearing of individuals. The community can view the meeting by following the steps which will be listed on the agenda. If there are members of the community who would like to attend the meeting in person, please note that masks and social distancing are optional in accordance with the guidance received from the local DOH and CDC. Action will be taken. With that, I'd like to make a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Board Member Second. Thank you, Board Member Second Cable. All in favor? Carries unanimous. All right, we are adjourning at 7:41 p.m.